I started with the diocese probably around about the end of September 2005 it was, and quite coincidentally in the immediate aftermath of me starting, the various pieces of stone fell from the arch down at the to the left of the altar inside the cathedral, and also a fairly dramatic breakaway of the buttress on this northern tower outside, so that was a clear indication the building was calling out for some attention, certainly some issues, and particularly with stone falling inside, health and safety issues. So we started looking into what might be the cause of these problems around about then. I guess very early on in my tenure, I hadn't had the opportunity to have a good look at the building, so of course these couple of events started that process, for want of a better expression. It became clear just looking at the building, you almost read it like a book to a degree, the fairly dramatic telltale signs of structural movement throughout the building. It's transpired has broken its back in 2 or 3 places. They're evident through cracks in the wall. We hadn't realised at that time it was as severe in the context that it went all the way down through the foundation of the building. And once we started looking into that, trying to identify suitable engineers to provide some advice. However, at the same time we also looked into the history of the building as much as we could do. We researched a lot of newspaper articles, things like earthquakes back in 1918 that had impacted the region as a whole were very relevant, and there's also a lot of difficulty with the building around about 1927. It started with dysfunctional drainage, which in turn had affected the foundation of the building. So I guess some of these telltale signs sort of launched us fairly and squarely into a full-blown assessment of the building, and resulted in the works that we've actually done to it. And a lot of this sort of part of Rockhampton, in actual fact the most of Rockhampton, would be built on a floodplain, with the exception of the buildings up on the range. It really is floodplain in immediate proximity of the river, Fitzroy River. So I guess coupled with that, the fact that it's very highly reactive clay soil, means that it's very susceptible to the effects of the wet-dry cycle. So we have these extended periods of drought for 1 and 2 decades, and then particularly recently, I mean this is since the project commenced, but the last 4 years have been unbelievably wet, and this year would be a classic case in point, where we've received 1100 millimetres so far of rain, when the annual median rainfall for Rock is around about the 790 mark. So once this clay wets up, it starts to go squidgy, and it swells, and the mass of the towers start sort of moving around. That's not so relevant now, though. Those sort of dramatic events happen in the early settlement of the building. A lot of the severe movements already taken place. When we surveyed the building, we've got the benefit of some fairly modern technology now. They use lasers and GPS and those sorts of things. So we've actually found the 2 front towers to be leaning diagonally towards the central park, sort of generally in a northerly direction, by about 10 inches, which is 250 mils, 25 centimetres, quite substantial. And the movement of those towers outwards has had a stretching effect, if you like, on the building. Now stone obviously doesn't stretch at all, so it's apparent in various areas down the length of the building where the cracks have opened up, and you can actually sort of measure, you know, 65 mils here, 45 millimetres there, and almost pretty much account for the 250 millimetres. The building was actually re-roofed in 1911. It was open for use in 1899. Originally had a slate roof on at that time. Now, the fact that it was re-roofed sort of 11, 12 years after it was built is an indication of this stretching action that's occurred within the building. That would have obviously opened up gaps within the slate, so it became necessary to re-roof it in that first 10 years, which is quite extraordinary really, and would have been a big expense. So that's the first major job that we're aware of. Then we jumped through to 1927, I mentioned that earlier, and there was substantial work done then. There was lowering of ground levels because by some means the ground levels around the cathedral had built up. The drains were broken and cracked and dysfunctional, and then there's a strong reference made to the cracks and the fissures throughout the building as a result of this structural movement. We also recently found some documentation from the manufacturers of the stained glass windows, Hardman Studios, which indicate that they came over in around about that time to attend to damage to the windows as a result of the structural movement. There was some work done prior to that in 1918. I referred earlier to the earthquake in the region. Now the articles we've found on that were in the immediate aftermath of that event and indicate that neither St Joseph's Cathedral nor St Paul's Anglican Cathedral were damaged substantially. However, it's notable that flying buttresses were removed from the side aisles in 1918. There's some description of them being found to be unsafe, so I wouldn't mind betting the earth movement gave those a bit of a jolt and they decided to take them down. Now they were a structural element. They held up or pushed together not necessarily pushed together, but stopped the upper nave walls pushing out. Removed in 1918 and nothing was done to compensate for their removal until 1927 when the steel tie rods were put through. They sort of, at the moment, look like they were put through just to hang fans off, but they actually hold the building together. With the weight of that slate roof bearing down on the upper nave's walls, trying to push them out, that would have been of the greatest detriment to the building. We then jump on to move forward to around about the late 1940s, 1949, there was a fairly significant cyclone which appears from the photos in the Morning Bulletin to have blown various substantial pieces of stone down. In the early to mid 50s, around about 54, I think there was a major repointing or regrouting of the outside of the cathedral. The extension was put on in 1983, the completion of it, because up until that point it had remained with a temporary back wall in it, unfinished. So that was put on in 83, and there was some work done to the cathedral at that point. We found various dates, 83 scratched in stone, especially up around the spires. And then in 1999 there was a centenary event, 100 years old for the building. We understand there was a good amount of work done around about that time, and we've certainly found the use of prolific use of silicon around the building, which sort of dates to around that time. There's probably not much that we haven't tinkered or tampered with. As I say, one of the key things was to sort out ground movement and try and make the building less susceptible to the effects of moisture getting down to the foundations of the building. Now, we're provided with a quote to underpin the building, $33 million, which was cost prohibitive. Underpinning is basically a procedure whereby they dig down or drill down at the sides of the building and underneath slightly and pour a series of concrete piles, and they sort of hit one, miss one, and then come back and fill in the gap sort of thing. We're advised that we'd have to drill down around about the 18 metres for those, so masses of concrete and things. Now that would have certainly put the building on a sure foundation, but $33 million, I think the building's insured for around about $54 million to rebuild it from scratch. So in the scale of economies, it sort of wasn't an option to a degree. So again, on the advice of engineers, we were sort of pushed towards consideration of putting in an engineered designed stormwater drain system to adequately take all the stormwater off the site and away from the building, certainly in the immediate proximity of the building, which say would be sort of the 2 to 5 metres. And on top of that drainage system, which is under the ground, we'd put this impervious apron, for want of a better expression, around the building. So we've actually formed that with a fairly substantial concrete slab and finished it off with a cobblestone. So that really was, that's a sort of fairly significant conservation initiative to conserve, and we'll never stop the building moving because it's, well, say never stop the building has really gone through its settlement process, and that would have happened within the first 5 to 10 years. What we really want to do is to try and minimise any, big threat of future movement to it. Moving on from that, we had to replace the top sections of the spires. They were the big bronze crosses up there, which weigh about 2.5 tons. They were fixed using a pendulum-like mechanism. On the bottom of the cross was affixed a long chain that hung 5 metres down inside the spire itself, and on the bottom of that was a cubic metre of stone. So it hung there, and that worked very well for a period of time, but with the effects of wind and wind movement on those crosses, they moved about, and you've got this massive weight around about 3 tons that cubic metre of stone would have weighed rather, just crushing the very slender upper sections of the spire. They in turn cracked and let moisture through there, moisture on the steel chain. The chain started to rust, so we're thinking around about 1983 somebody went up there and put some galvanised steel straps around those cracked members, which was a fairly good initiative. But over the 20 or 30 years, I mean, it was a good initiative because it gave that extra length of life. But it was really time to get in and properly address that issue. So that was a large component. Around about $250,000 was spent on craning those items off. Reproducing them was just a marvel, really, to be able to get the masons to identically copy those items, and then of course we put it in using a different fixing method. So starting at the top down, we've installed around about 20 tons of lead to a lot of the parapet cornices. They're protruding features which stick out, and as rain comes down from the sky, it works its way down the building. Some of those sticky outy bits, for want of a better expression, are susceptible to wear and tear. Lead is a traditional material to use to protect such items. So for the very first time we've used lead on the building, carried out a number of modifications and improvements to the stormwater system, introduced 2 new downpipes to decant the massive volume of stormwater directly from the upper nave roof down to ground, and not coming via the side aisle roofs. With the volume of rain that we experience in Rockhampton, they were tending to get quite overwhelmed, and water was ingressing through there. So that was a good long-term initiative. Stained glass windows have been attended to. Some of them have been cleaned. They're in fairly good condition on the basis that they were removed in 1989 and flown back to England for full restoration works, and it was anticipated the longevity or the worth of those works would go for about 80 years. So we're not 30 years, should have another 50 years to go on those. What we have done, we've removed some mild steel grills that were protecting those windows. Steel being steel sort of expands and contracts in the heat of Rockhampton and the cold, so they were sort of moving around and causing an alarming amount of damage to the stone mullions and the window surrounds in general, causing rust stains on the windowsills, which are still apparent around the building. We've replaced those with a toughened steel glass. So they offer a far greater level of protection to the windows, not just from rock throwing and things, but they really stop the wind and the dust and the rain driving against them. And it's a fairly unique feature of the cathedral. These windows they were made by Hardman Studios. That was a company founded in around about the 1830s. They've supplied stained glass windows to many famous cathedrals and churches throughout Europe, and indeed they did the stained glass windows in the House of Parliament in the UK. So they were sort of ordered, exported out here, and in actual fact from 1899 when the building was built, the first consignments came in 1901, 1902, 1904. There was a further delivery made in 1949, and they also supplied the windows for the extension in 1983. So the cathedral actually benefits from a complete and full set of Hardman windows, which is quite rare really for a manufacturer to have that continuity over almost a century, really, 85 years certainly, to keep going back to have modifications, restoration work and resupply done. So they would be, well, they're probably priceless really. They're beautiful windows. They'd be amongst the most distinctive in Australia really. Coming down the building again, the concrete slab involved lowering of the ground level by 6 inches. That had been built up again since the 1920s. That raising of the ground level sort of increases level up against the building. You get moisture trapped in the bottom stones around the building. Sandstone being sandstone, it started as compressed sand and can fairly readily return to compressed sand. So as a result of this ground level being too high, there's a lot of fretting going on in the lower level of stone around the cathedral, so it was really imperative that to stop that rotting and deteriorating any further, that we lowered that ground level, let the moisture out and let the lower course of stone sort of breathe. The most recent, there's a myriad of other repairs. We replaced the louvers to the towers, all 800 of them, and various other things. Most recent addition is the covered structure just in the eastern courtyard here, which is probably, I mean, it's quite historical in many respects. It's the first addition, if you like, to the extension really at the back in 1983 was more a case of completing the building. This is a brand new independent structure, if you like, and it was built for a purpose really, and it was really a bit of an adaptation process. You've got a building here that was is probably 115 years old. Christianity sort of ebbs and flows through the decades, but it's I think with changing society, you've really got to make provision for keeping some relevance to the building. We live in a very multicultural society these days, and we also have a lot of religions mixed in there, you know, whether it be Islam, Hindu, and there's a myriad of other religions out there. Now those people respect the church and they'll come to a church, but some of them won't come into the church building. So the provision of a formal covered area with sound, with visual, etc., sort of gives a facility or an amenity to have, you know, religious type functions and accommodate people like that. There'd be atheist people as well that would come to, I mean, we have the law service here, we have police commemoration day. I mean, you don't necessarily have to be Christian to come to church, and of course we have weddings and funerals and the like. So that'll accommodate all that, and it's been quite fortuitous in one respect, because we're now just at a time where grade 7 are moving up to high school. Cathedral College next door has around about 1,100 students, and the influx of these grade 7 into their already fairly large school effectively means they've outgrown the cathedral, so they'll still be able to use the cathedral, it'll still maintain its relevance at various times in the year for them, and they'll have that overflow facility out there for their additional students. They can listen to the service and watch and be engaged really, as opposed to having to have all their religious services and things over in the school hall. So there are a number of things. In Australia, I think it's one of a group of only 5 or 7 Gothic cathedrals. Out of those 5 or 7, it actually qualifies as being the most northerly, so that's a little bit of uniqueness. However, it's understood that the cathedral would be the only 19th century Gothic cathedral in the entire tropical hemisphere of the world. So that really sort of sets it apart, and then you start looking at aspects of the cathedral such as the stained glass windows, which are quite exceptional, as we've already mentioned earlier on. I personally find it incredible that a building of this size and of this expense would be built in a very small sort of regional town, really. Brisbane was Brisbane back in the 1800s, and Rockhampton was really set to become a capital of the rest of Queensland, which didn't eventuate. But nevertheless, Rockhampton had a population of around about 11,600 at the time, and the cathedral was built with funded by the people of central Queensland. Might have been some money coming down from the north, but it wasn't hugely well established at that time. So it's a magnificent building. Really. You could comfortably take it and put it in London, Paris, any of the European cities, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, and it's very respectable, really.